Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Shikha Hornsey, and I'll be the moderator for this CIO Roundtable discussion of rethinking digital transformation post-COVID. We'll have a quick round of introductions, and then we'll start the discussion. So a little about me first. I've been a group CIO in both New York and London. My last role was as the CIO for the post office, and it finished at the end of April. I'm a transformational CIO, and my core skill set is actually transforming global legacy institutions. I have a master's in electrical engineering and systems design and bioelectronics, and that's one of the reasons, because I'm a transformational CIO, the COVID issues that we're discussing are very near and dear to my heart, since it is all about digital transformation. Having said that, let me just hand it off to the rest of my panelists. Would you like to go? Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah, Philip, go for it.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm a CIO. I've worked in the digital space for 20 years. If you're in the UK and you watch digital TV or listen to digital radio or use a blue light vehicle, all of those things were digital projects that I was part of. So yeah, big background in digital, worked in telecoms, property and energy, as well as media. So yeah, I'm pleased to be here and happy to be part of this session this morning. Thanks, Shikha.
Gavin?
Yeah, Gavin Killen, similar enough, work in the digital transformation space. I've led digital transformations in airlines, banks, and currently in energy.
Nathan?
Hi, I'm Nathan Marsh. I'm the Chief Digital Officer at Costain. We're a FTSE listed organisation that delivers and operates UK national infrastructure. I'm Costain's first Chief Digital Officer, so there's a lot of transformation we need to do to our business and also to our sector.
Cool. Simon?
And Simon Evans from Arup. So I've got a couple of hats. I work closely in the digital transformation space and have done for a number of years, previously Director of Digital in Atkins, but my role mostly in Arup is in the space of looking after digital within our energy markets and what we can do there. I also work really closely in the digital twin space and look after our agenda for digital twins and how we're going to respond to that. And the final piece is I'm heavily involved in the Centre for Digital World Britain and the National Digital Twin Programme, the work they're doing around creating an ecosystem of connected twins. So engineer by background, then went into tech and blend the two together. You've got digital engineering, and that's the space I work in.
Great. So let's jump into the questions, gentlemen. For the first one, we have the fact that we've heard many positive transformation stories in the recent months. How are we now planning and adapting the way our businesses work so that culturally these changes can be permanently bought into by every part of the business? Phil?
Yeah, no, thank you, Shikha. That's a great question to start us off. So that's great. So I think we've all been through an amazing journey certainly the last few months with COVID, but probably over the last 5 or so years in the UK in most sectors, and all sectors seem to be moving at a different speed. I think certainly in my world, the last 5 months has accelerated the digital proposition that we offer and the team's ability to do that. And we've largely divided that into sort of three main areas. We've definitely accelerated our sort of people and our culture. That's changed our operating model around that. We've allowed people to be more financially autonomous and have more control over their budget decisions in the sort of financial domain. And like everybody, I'm sure on the call, we've also advanced our technology thinking and adopted more remote working, more cloud usage, and started to look very sort of differently at our technical stack. In the people and culture domain, we've pushed sort of really hard. We had a very large offshore contingent. We've got people that operate around the world, and all of whom have been impacted by COVID at different times to the UK in different lockdowns at different points. And we've had to adapt to all of that. So we've encouraged very much a strong working from home culture. And in some cases, our suppliers have engaged with us on that and said, well, look, if we can adopt a working from home culture in the long term, then we can look at that cost base and we can share that cost benefit with you if we reduce office space in India or the Philippines or South Africa or Mexico or Eastern Europe, wherever it may be. So there's a sort of positive benefit for the employees that we have around the world and the partners and their employees in those sorts of financially considered cultural cultural changes. I mentioned we've also given people a lot of autonomy in the finance space, and we've allowed people to control their budgets. We've allowed people to be more autonomous in the way that they control their deliverables and the way they operate their teams and the finances that go around that. And empowering those people obviously gives them a lot of extra responsibility. Some have never had that responsibility, and we've sort of worked with them to coach and mentor them to how to behave if something goes wrong, and how to be upfront and declare it, and then how to manage around it. Not everything goes smoothly all the time from a financial perspective in major programs. And then lastly, I suspect, like everybody else here today, we've done an awful amount of technology evolution. We've pushed very hard on our legacy stacks. We've removed a lot of legacy IT. We have minimised our sort of ongoing legacy systems, including databases that are many years old, and mainframes and various other things that need to be dealt with. We have started to push the data into modern digital stacks. We've simplified our digital stacks. We've looked at customer journeys. We've done an absolute sort of ton of stuff simultaneously, and worked really, really hard through the sort of last 4 or 5 months. Just to get everything working better for our customer base. So we have 3 really big themes around sort of culture, people, the finance part, and the technology part, all enduring. They will all be part of the future. The plan is not to go backwards now.
Yeah, I understand. I have a couple of questions for you. From a compliance perspective, if you push the finance pieces and made it more autonomous, does that also mean that you had to augment your compliance functions?
So I think the finance team worked really, really hard. It's a collaborative piece. So the finance team worked really, really hard with the engineering development community to help them understand where there are still boundaries, but help them understand where those boundaries have changed and where the new boundaries sit. Give them some confidence that the finance team will work with them rather than sort of at a distance, to figure out how you can reforecast and replan and from a financial perspective. We've given some of the engineering community some education, so we've explained the difference between how you capitalise and how you're operating expenses, and what's exceptional and what's not, and various other things. And of course all of that sort of rapidly changed as we went through COVID, as everything sort of got invested in a different speed. So those sorts of things, I think the finance community have been amazing. Actually, they've helped the team understand how to behave appropriately in a different world. So and then governance around risk has been sort of treated in a similar way. As long as the communities in the IT function are declaring their risk and thinking about risk and managing them, whether it's cyber or anything else, then again, very mature behaviour has emerged over the last few months that sort of starts to make everybody much more autonomous.
Another question, which is the fact that all the changes that you've put in, it's understood, obviously, for COVID, we've had to react at speed. So were the changes strategic or tactical, or a bit of both, where you ended up basically, you're still doing cleanup because what I've seen is that we reacted first in different enterprises, and then had to tie up the loose ends, the cleanup, to make sure that we digitize the processes that we have, made it remote, made working remotely easier. But a lot of times it wasn't a strategic decision, it was more reactive because we had to survive. And now I'm seeing enterprises where they're going back and making sure that things are tied in at the back end.
No, we did both. I think similar to as you described. Immediately at the beginning, it was very reactive. We were able, due to the care that the team historically were used to taking, to record what had been done very carefully. So it wasn't sort of fire and forget. It was actually properly documented, although they were left as actions and things to return to, including business continuity planning. We made changes on the fly to how we did the BCP activities. But then I set up a separate team of equal importance, equal gravitas, so it's not a shadow team, to then go back and do some of those enduring amendments to the way we operate. So one team was forging ahead and getting things done to keep us trading, and then one team came in behind to do a sort of fairly material enduring change to policies or technology or cyber or whatever the thing that needed to be cleaned up. So yeah, we did both, and I think that leaves behind something which is properly tied off. Now if we end up going into a second wave in the UK at some point, then we've got all of that locked in, ready for wave 2, on the assumption it's all still valid during that same process again.
I have further questions about outsourcing, but I'll leave that to the end and not derail the conversation. Simon, would you like to add something?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going particularly onto that cultural piece that you mentioned in your question. I think the interesting part is how can we allow this to persist in what are quote unquote the new normal, which as a side note, I find that phrase the most frustrating thing that's come out of this. It's overused as a buzzword in its own right. But the kind of the flexibility that this has demonstrated that it is possible for people to work at home and work remotely. Some industries obviously harder, traders where they have a lot more security, and others less desirable, like teaching. But that flexibility is there. And I think the cultural side that we're now going to see individuals and organizations where they used to have, let's say, the work from office was their default, and maybe they might work from home a day a week or 2 days a week. It's going to be flipped as a narrative, isn't it, now, where we're going to see culturally people say, actually, I want to work from home as my default position, and I might be in the office here and now, if possible. So I think for me, the biggest thing is that cultural stick. How can we get that to land? What can we do around that? And I think it's around that flexibility that comes from it and allowing that to persist. But I do think as well, the interesting point that Philip mentioned there, and you mentioned as well around the cleanup, and if we did some strategic or tactical pieces, are we now going and mopping up and trying to close the gaps? And what I thought was really interesting is a lot of organizations, and my wife, she's works in an organization where this is similar. They say it was not really possible to work from home, and then suddenly they could. So it makes you think a question, are there lots of companies who aren't maybe so digitally mature who've now just opened up their whole network to the internet without realizing what they've done and created a massive vulnerability? So are we going to see in the next period of time a huge wave now of just cyber attacks or data breaches that are going to come out and surface that maybe already happened, but no one wants to talk about them because we're trying to survive. So that's all I'd say at the moment. I'd say.
Yeah, I agree, because we've had evolutionary change forced on us. My bachelor's degree is in biology, so forgive me, I tie everything back to biology and evolution and stuff. So we've had change forced on us at rapid speed. So we're hoping to react to, it's akin to like the meteor hitting the earth kind of thing. So we're hoping and trying to adapt, which is great. So I think from a need perspective, we've had that, but because we've had to evolve at speed, we've left ourselves fairly, wide open. Because, for example, as I said, my skill set is legacy transformation. One of the first things you do when you walk into a legacy environment that's really old school, and I tend to go for, enterprises that are at least a century old. So you can imagine that, if it's a fully analog legacy institution, you kind of defy somebody, a hacker to get in there, because you figure they have no idea what to do, because it's not
such a disaster.
But once you digitize it, unless you've got the appropriate security in place, you're leaving yourself wide open. And I think there are some institutions that have done that. So to your point, I think it's well made, the fact that this is probably the beginning of people and data and just widespread security breaches, which is where our CISO brethrens are losing. On the one hand, they're losing sleep. On the other hand, they've never been more critical. So so let me go on to the next question. We can come back and address the rest of the stuff that this particular question brought up. So I'm going to go for the working from home piece, which is that we addressed already, where working from home and not in a corporate headquarters or a static office has certainly leveled the playing field for individuals who didn't necessarily have the opportunity to live in large metro hubs like London or New York. So what opportunities are we seeing now? Now that location is not necessarily a factor when recruiting the best talent for our businesses, and it becomes more a question of digital connectivity. And if you actually have sufficient bandwidth, you're golden. So, Gavin?
Yeah, I think one of the great benefits of what we've just seen and what we're still seeing is that we're no longer constrained. And somebody touched on the point earlier on. Well, we all had to be in the office. No, we couldn't work remotely. Now we can. all of a sudden. So with that in mind, people that you could never come to the table before can have a seat at the table, because it doesn't matter where you're located. You've got the tools and you've got the connectivity and the right skills. We can invite you to come down and sit at the table and work with us. And so the benefit being that from a pure digital side, your talent pool just expanded the whole way out, where in more traditional organizations where they did want people sitting at a desk in the building because that was the model, well, that's no longer the case. So now, come and join us. It doesn't matter where you are, it doesn't matter where you sit, it doesn't matter your socioeconomic background. If you've got kind of connectivity and you can do the job, you can work. So I think it's a great leveler. It's going to give people opportunities that haven't had opportunity before to basically come and work, to be honest. I mean, I think it comes down to being that simple. We've seen ourselves, even over the past month, where we've started to recruit far and wide. So we would typically have geo-dispersed teams or offshore partners or whatever else. So we're kind of used to that environment, but there's always people in the office and then people maybe dialed into meetings. Now everybody's dialed in, everybody's on Teams, everybody's in the same, in the same situation. So it's easier. There's no them and us type of partner side, but also when we go and recruit people, we're interviewing on Teams, we're hiring on Teams, we're onboarding on Teams, or whatever platform that it is Teams, obviously, whatever the platform of choice is, and it's much easier to do. So I think if we can make sure that we enable that the friction isn't there to onboard people, then just keep expanding, get the best time. I've just pulled a couple of people in from London to a Dublin-based team that we have, and equally a Spanish person into a London-based team that we have, because they had the right skills, and we never would have kind of looked that far out. So yeah, I just think it brings that opportunity for wider communities to get involved where they might not be able to get involved before.
Yeah, I kind of understand that. The thing is, I also want to play devil's advocate in that while it casts a broader net for talent, it also means that the talent that you get are, they have to be somewhat technically savvy as well.
Oh, absolutely. So it's not just let them come to the table, can you do the job? I absolutely can. Great. Well, then it doesn't matter where you are. I think that's the real key to it. You don't need to be in a particular location anymore. You don't need to, be able to commute straight into the centre of London to be able to work with a Salesforce.org or whatever that needs to be in London.
So the question is this then, do you also feel the need to, would you be happy if everything was remote for all time in perpetuity? Or, for example, do you miss any of the office camaraderie? Because we've seen lots of examples where people are bemoaning the fact, and I'm not talking about the fact that it's summer here and they miss the air conditioning, but do you think that there's any real need to set up physical spaces where, like, the future of work kind of thing?
Yeah, I think like you look at Shopify, and they've always had a remote work office, and they have this kind of pop-up office for when they need it. I think there are times when it is really beneficial to have people in a room, but until they solve the social distancing challenges that we have around where we're at, I don't think anybody wants to go back to an office where they're sitting beside somebody that they're not. Well, and people don't know. We're all sitting around in masks. And equally, if we're sitting in the office and everybody else is on Teams anyway, what's the point of being in the office? But I do think, I think we'll miss it when we get into the deeper planning of what the future is, what next year is, and the year after, when that traditional big wall whiteboard is now gone, and we're using digital tools to do that. I think some people will struggle with that. So if they're not used to being remote, or they're not used to using digital tools as well as physical tools that they'd be used to, it's going to be a challenge. Absolutely. And I think that's our job, is to bring them on that journey and say, not that bad, okay? You don't need to be there. Here's how you do this,
So I agree. I just think that that the remote working is more of a tactical response. Well, obviously it is a tactical response to COVID, but it's, I think strategically we miss a core piece of the business model unless, we congregate in some form in a somewhat scheduled manner, I guess. And I think eventually we will feel that lack if we don't already. But Nathan, do you want to give us your
Yeah,
thoughts?
look, I think we're definitely seeing some kind of game-changing opportunities and one or two risks because circumstances have been forced upon us. But I do think we should credit ourselves with a bit of ingenuity about how quickly people have responded and businesses have responded. I mean, work is now absolutely an activity, not a destination, not purely a destination. And I think that's really then given us license to kind of reinvent and revisit our relationship with business and commerce and where it fits into our life. I think there's a lot more diversity around location and timing, and particularly we're now no longer completely constrained to a fixed office or an office that we go to in routine. Then we can look at a global workforce easier than we have done in the past. So I think the employee and colleague offer has probably got a bit richer. You can work from home or site or office or a hub, and you can connect with colleagues, around the country, around the world, and around the clock. And some would say, well, you've always been able to do that, Nathan, but we're seeing this now almost become more of a default way of working. I think that's really exciting. My knowledge is certainly getting richer from connecting globally with people, so that's great. I guess, one of the risks would be, or questions we ask ourselves is, are you working from home or are you living at work? And that's, a neat challenge for us to try and reconcile, because some of the systems and networks are getting very persuasive and intuitive to use. And, Costain, 3,800 people, we had about a 6-month timeline to roll out Teams. We did it in about 4 days. And we need to be cognizant of the impact of that, because not everyone is a technologist, and that's a good thing, by the way. So I think, some opportunities there, but I'm not blind to the challenges that it can bring us as a business, as an economy, and also as a society.
Yes, and I was thinking as well from a society perspective, I've seen the working days become longer. In fact, I'm not even sure you would call it a working day, because there's very little downtime. You don't, really disconnect because of the availability of technology being always on, which from a work perspective, up to a point, as long as there's no burnout, is good. However, from a society perspective, it may not be. I mean, people talk about the next generation, kids, grandkids, what have you, of being very digitally focused. They'd rather text and pick up the phone or even talk to somebody, So I can see that beginning to happen to our existing generation in a way, where you lose that ability to interact with people if they're not on a screen. So
I think that's right. I think what we were expecting, 4 months ago to have been maybe a 10-year path to greater digital working, greater digital adoption, we've probably done it in about 10 weeks. And I don't think as a society, globally or nationally, we've really gone through and worked through, because we didn't have time, all the consequences of that. And there's some good, and probably there's some less good that we need to focus on as well.
Phil, did you want to add something to that? I saw you. I wasn't sure whether you were gesturing or.
I think Nathan's point's right, and I think I'd share some of your thoughts as well, Shikha, on some FaceTime is still valuable as we adjust, I think, a little bit. So yeah, we'll perhaps come back to that later.
Okay, all right. I do have a question which I'm just going to throw out there because, and the others I'll wait till the end, but someone's asking what the panel's view is on hiring remotely and missing out on the face-to-face question, but we can address that afterwards. But I think we kind of already have, where my own personal opinion is it's great that we can hire remotely, but eventually that FaceTime interaction has to occur. And I think for the more routine jobs, it's definitely a real positive, where the FaceTime interactions for people isn't necessarily required, but for career growth, I think it is required. But does anybody want to comment on that, or we can go on to the next question? Okay, I'll go on to the next question then.
No, I would. I'd come back. I think you're right. I think for the day-to-day functional piece of work that needs to get done, so if you're hiring somebody for a particular role, it's easy. It's just you're doing it over a camera. It is the career progression part, and it's also this is where you're coming to work. There is a lot to be said for that HQ experience, or that ops experience. It has its own energy and a vibe to it, which is no longer there. So they can't get the sense of other people and also other departments. So the Nathan's point of what's not going to be something, or what we're going to learn and they feel it's going to be, for later on, is that we really have not solved how are we going to avoid silos across our business units. Because it's okay at a leadership level where we're all talking, we're all chatting, but as that filters down and gets wider, those conversations are going to go further and further away. So we're running the risk of the bright sparks, the people that hear or pick up and come in. They don't get to do that because it's not there. So there's a bigger conversation that happen around how do we avoid silos, and what does that look like? And are we going to have to take a hit in our overall output capacity to make sure that we shore that up via, could be meetings or whatever else? Something has to give, because there's X amount of time in any given week. As you say, people can be on all the time, but depending on your level inside the organization, you expect people to be on for more than 8 hours. So how do we make sure they don't get lost, and how do they progress?
Yes, because what I'm seeing as well across different industries is the fact that it's like that old game of telephone, where, from an executive discussion perspective, you have certain principles and they're communicated clearly. But as it ripples through the organizations, when it's remote, people, it gets translated slightly differently, and it's like the virus, it keeps mutating from person to person, that kind of thing. And by the end of it, if you have remote workers, they don't have the camaraderie or the team ability, especially if you're new to an organization, to be able to pick up the phone or indeed know who to talk to, really. And there are people that are feeling lonely is not the correct word, but something along those lines, where they're isolated in silos, where they don't know how to react.
Yeah,
I think that might open up a newer or newish responsibility for us around digital ethics. Conventionally we'd consider digital ethics associated with, the source code and machine learning, how that's applied for decisioning. But there's a broader approach now, I think, required around us as employers, and the ethical considerations that we need to bring into some of the working conditions that are enforced upon us and that we enforce upon colleagues.
Yeah, I agree. So I'll go on to the next question, which is the fact that a key factor when executing change in a business is being able to build trust with other departments who may not be as tech savvy as those implementing the change. We've already touched on this a bit. So how are you establishing trust in a virtual work environment to enable your business to continue transforming?
It comes really nicely off the previous conversation, doesn't it? I think there's some really interesting points being said there, particularly around Nathan's example of rolling out teams in a matter of days instead of a matter of weeks or months. And that works for us digital natives. That's the roles we all have. But quite rightly, those that aren't actually find that really stressful. So it's easy for us in our segment to say, oh, look how successful that was. We've rolled out a massive change program. People were resilient. They adapted. But that is going to be hard. And I think the trust part is really built around the communication and just having the right support there to be able to help those who maybe aren't as quick to pick up on the mark, to be able to adapt to this. Much more customer-centric, if you will, and business-centric, to avoid, I guess, in essence, as well as having random shadow ITs pop up in a response to what we've done here, which is absolutely going to happen. And kind of looping that back to some of what we were just saying around the importance of face-to-face time in that trust, I think, is that some of the incentives we had for being in the office, and there's a lot to be said around it, is those water cooler moments where you could collaborate with each other, you could share, you could talk, you could help someone informally. Of course, if you can't have those moments now, then it really changes the landscape. And we probably all have seen that now life is lived through increments of 30-minute Teams meetings, and there's pretty much no time in between that at all. You just bounce from one to the other, to the other, to the other, and bringing that back, trying to make it a bit more grounded, and putting in your fake commute time, but as you would do to another meeting, to give yourself some headspace. Because I imagine everyone on this panel here has probably had moments where they've ate their lunch with their webcam off because they're bouncing between meetings and they can't do anything else. That's kind of now the standard, isn't it? So yeah, going back to kind of grounding it into what we're saying here, I think there have been some massive positives that come from this in how it's been rolled out. So obviously those who have been more digitally native have helped those that aren't. And then we've seen a lot of colleagues really support each other, and that's been useful. From our perspective in our organisation, the communications and the way our organisation responds, and all organisations respond to it, has been a key factor in how it goes down and how it resonates. Some have been quite frantic, naturally, because they don't really know how they're responding themselves. Others have been a bit more calm and measured, and that's really helped with the rollout. But the final part I'll add is we've seen some leaps and bounds in working practices that I think are really valued by individuals, and they can see the importance that would have been very hard to do otherwise. Now, what I'm particularly referring to is virtual whiteboarding. We do a lot of workshops in person. There's a lot of benefit from bringing people together, and we know what those are like. Breakout groups. You have one guy with or girl with a pen, and the post-its being dominant. It's basically their view, and no one else collaborates. But with these virtual whiteboarding softwares, we've seen loads of people from every part of the demographic who do or don't understand technology quite easily access it and take part in activities where you can now engage and collaborate with a lot more people. And we've seen that adoption happen a lot faster than we would have through any change program or any kind of incentivization. So the interesting part here is really that how do we, in our position as leaders, communicate this out properly and allow and provide the right support mechanisms so those that aren't digitally native feel like they can embrace this.
And it's not just within our teams, because mostly in technology, that's what we get hired for. But it's more specifically true in the business, where if they're not, certainly I'm bringing it back to legacy, and certainly for the older businesses, sometimes it's really difficult, and giving them that sense of care, I guess, from a leader perspective, is absolutely mandatory somehow or other. So no employee left behind kind of thing.
That's it.
Yeah.
So anyone else want to add anything to that?
I think it's fascinating. I think we touched on it in all the points, all the questions so far. I was reading a bit, and I'm not a psychologist, but I was reading a bit on the psychology of this recently, and speaking to someone who is far more enabled or better to think about this than I do, and they came to the conclusion that it takes, in terms of trust, it takes sort of 6 to 7 hours of being with someone online before you feel like whether or not you can fully trust them or not. And some of that comes from, do they say do they do what they commit to do? If they say they're going to do something, do they go and do it? Is there the right level of sort of empathy in terms of understanding their own sort of personal situation? We're all sat here looking into each other's houses, and that breaks down barriers that the coffee coffee machine moment didn't ever achieve. And then I think also that sort of level of, if someone says, look, I can't join that call because I'm just busy doing something that I picked up on, an action on a previous call, then there's got to be a level of appreciation of that, because I think Simon's right. It's very easy to go back to back from early in the morning till early in the evening. And if you work for an organisation that has an international presence in India or West Coast or Australia, then you can easily do 18 hours a day quite happily. So I think there has to be some moderation. That has to come from a level of trust. People just say, I just can't do it. I've got other things I have to do. It has to be a sort of level of that. I think that comes from working together for seemingly a period of, the science seems to say, 6 to 7 hours, and before people understand how to trust each other a bit more.
So do you know what the metric is for that level of trust when it's physical presence and not digital?
No, actually, that's a good. So this is to say, I'm no expert in the psychology of it, but it does seem that
no, it's
online. Yeah, I don't know. Probably less. I'm guessing less. People can read. It comes back to, I think it was Gavin mentioned earlier, and it comes back to elements of sort of body language as well. There's an element of, these platforms don't allow as easily for people to read body language. I think that's one of the major disadvantages. If you could find a way of doing something that indicated body language in some kind of emotive way or digital way, that would be fantastic. But no one's done it quite yet. But yeah,
we need emojis on Teams.
but yeah, there's a whole trust factor. I think is a really important thing. To how do you get that? How long does it take? You know, the points that were made by sort of Simon, you know, earlier around, you know, how do you get that sort of digital engagement with people that are sort of perhaps less digital, less digitally aware, less inclined to be digital, even if they've got the skills they choose not to be, perhaps. So yeah.
Although you bring up a good point. One of the things I think of as a real positive for this is the fact that we've suddenly engaged in our, which I could also argue is a bad thing, but it's, in this case, it's I think of it as a positive. We've also engaged in our colleagues' personal lives, and you know, for example, I know the names, faces, mannerisms of not only partners but children and pets. So you know, it's kind of nice in that regard. You know, it much more integrating, and I would argue that that's that goes a long way towards building that kind of camaraderie that the water cooler, you know, stops and do kind of. But yeah, it's, you know, as long as as long as we as leaders are aware of the fact that there could be negative aspects of people just accidentally not being engaged or feeling valued or cared for, and we address that, I think at least for the short term, we're okay.
Interesting one you say on pets there. Sorry, I was going to say pets and cats. So the one I've noticed that cats seem to love webcams. I'm not sure if you've got colleagues that
Yes.
walk right across and type on the keyboard. Sorry, Philip.
I think it's really interesting. I think there's you know, I've got a team of folk who, you know, range in demographic from one end of the scale to the other, and it's really interesting that the youngest members of the team are the ones that would like to get back in the office because they have, you know, home situations where they haven't got space and have a study or etc. Or they're still living at home and working in their bedroom as well as you know, sleeping there. And then you've got people who are towards the end of their sort of career, you know, typically age-wise. I'm not trying to be ageist, but who don't want to be at home. They, you know, they're quite happy to see their partner or their wife or husband, you know, for a few hours in the evening and at weekends, and that's about as much as they want to do. They'd like to be back in the office, some separation, and it's the band in the middle, interestingly, that have got, you know, kids and, you know, etc., who are actually most comfortable at home. They've got a place that's big enough to work and live in, and you know, the child arrangements and schools and stuff, it just makes it easier for them. It's really interesting too, the two ends of the age scale are the ones that really would like to be back in. It's not a technology thing, it's wider than that.
Yeah, I agree. It's a social demographic thing and where you are in the life cycle spectrum. So yeah, it is fascinating though, and I think to your point, after this, or as this progresses, well, see, being a New Yorker, the therapists are dime a dozen. I'm sure they'll start in London as well, and globally, where, you know, the therapists will be making mountains and just from this. So okay, so let me get to the next question, which is working remotely generated vast amounts of data being transferred across secure, partially secure, and sometimes very insecure networks, as we've already discussed. What systemic risks do you foresee the new way of working is bringing into each industry? We've already touched on this, but Nathan, do you want to start?
Thanks, Shikha. Yeah, look, this is a big deal, I think, for all companies, and from a personal perspective, I see it sort of we're far more on the front line now as breaches and attempted breaches in UK infrastructure are impacting us every day. So it's very much front of mind. But look, the operating environment has changed. We're online more. The volume of data that we're sharing, whether it's articles, whether it's through videos, whether it's through cloud, etc., is increasing. The types of data are growing in complexity and range. Just the time and bandwidth we're taking up is increasing. The variety of networks, secure, private and open are all meshed together. And also the use of an increased use of types of devices. So the whole landscape has got far more like a heavily congested, junction rather than a less congested sort of network that we used to work on, particularly around some of the controls that we have in office and site environments. And of course, we're only human, so our behaviours lapse over time. And I worry that some of our behaviours that are lapsing over time and that complex operating environment brings in more risk for us all. And it's a riskier world, so the threat landscape has changed. Cyber insurance premiums have shot up over the past 4 months as an indicator of that. So I guess the sort of position I wanted to share really, or some thinking I wanted to share, is that to operate in this new kind of riskier and more complex and less structured environment, we're trying to take a sort of a three-lensed approach on resilience. And we're obviously looking at physical resilience to keep sites and people secure, economic resilience to keep our projects going, and to keep our business going, and to make sure that the economy is going. And then finally, digital resilience. And I think where in the past those were quite close, now I'd sort of like to put it to the panel that those should be absolutely intertwined. And again, rather like the acceleration brought upon us by COVID, I think that what the past 4 months have done is brought together those things as almost inseparable. So I think we're operating in a riskier environment. It's far more complex, and I'm not sure anyone's got the instruction manual or the route map yet.
No, I would agree. I would also say that, dovetailing from the last point, the fact that we're all working from home, so we're more comfortable at home, and therefore we relax a little bit on our vigilance, to your point, even more so than we would in an office environment. And so therefore, and given the fact that most breaches from whatever kind usually start with user or human error, we've left ourselves wide open to, it's a hacker's or a malware enthusiast dream, really. So but yeah, it's definitely something that we have to address as collectively and as soon as possible. So but Gavin, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think exactly what's being said. I think you made the point earlier on about details all around the world are probably totally any left about what's happened. I think some organisations who were lucky enough to be set up for COVID. So we'd done the other side. We were actually going out to do a test on Office 365 and remote working across the organisation, 55,000 users on the Thursday. And we went into lockdown on the Friday. We never came back to the office, but we were lucky. But I think, Nathan, you said it was like Teams or whatever, Office 365 rolled out in 4 days. So, if you can find a kind of single solution that you can put protection around, I think that's okay. But equally, if we try and force people down, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other, people will always find a way, because they're trying to get something, maybe even themselves a file. They won't, the same thing, because they're at home, or they're using their home device because they got shipped out and nobody expected this. So they're on a BYOD, that there's no kind of VPN. We've just set it up so they can have stuff, or they Gmail themselves a file. Away you go. So it's really that it's starting to stop. It's starting to stop where we're kind of. I think Simon, the great phrase you used, the new norm, and how you just I'm just stop using new. Okay, we've got to find a way that we move forward. And the cleanup piece, Phil, that you were talking about, well, we made changes and we allowed stuff to happen so we could keep going. But now we've got almost like a full mop-up team coming in behind to shore up the gaps so that we could continue to work. It's exactly this around security, and it's exactly this around what works. How do we keep ourselves safe? How do we educate people to know just stop for a second without making it so painful that they skip the process? And now it's remote. You can't even get them in to do stuff. What's the ecosystem?
Yeah, because it's that classic contention between the business where it's all about what you can do and security where it's all about what you can't do or shouldn't do. But we're all batting for the same team, and but at the end of the day, right now we have, I think, because we've reacted so swiftly, we've had to. Which from a leadership perspective, you kind of have to go back and say, okay, fine. Kudos to all the technology teams that managed to do four days worth of work that would normally have taken them 10 years to do. But then you can turn around, flip it, and say, okay, so if you could do it in 4 days, why didn't you? But that's but because we have done it in 4 days, if we had done it maybe in 5 years rather than 10. We would have done it in not the correct order necessarily, but basically we would have dotted the I's and crossed the T's as we've gone along. Now we've just done it, and we've left ourselves exposed. And what my worry is, we've left ourselves exposed in places that we really didn't realize we were exposed. And so that's where I think a lot of the breaches and the vulnerabilities are going to come from. So, and we touched upon it before, the fact that I think there's probably a lot more happening. We just haven't, it's not as public as it possibly would have been in the past. But yeah, it's scary stuff, but I'm sure, we can address it at some point. It is something that, like I said, the legacy world in this case is the real positive with it is the fact that when everything's analog, you can't really you're going out of business in this world, but you're secure. So
I do think there's going to be a lot of conversations around maybe next year's planning around some stuff, and you come back and people will go, "You guys were going to take 6 months to do this, and as you said, you did it in 4 days." Why was it 6 months? Why was it a year if you could do it in 4 days? And yes, it might have been a pain for 4 days, but you did it in 4 days. So I think there's a lot of that's going to come out, that speed that people can actually move at. But it's only going to take one breach in one big org, and we're all going to just shut the doors down really quickly, and we're almost back to another COVID situation where we're going, don't care, lock it all down. And we start to open it up slowly. And that's really training on the business to be able to operate properly.
The problem though right now is the fact that there's some businesses that can handle that and some that can't afford to shut that down because they're on the brink right now anyway. And it could be from industries depending, like retail, for example, hospitality, they're all suffering badly. If any one of the giants there get breached, it will have a ripple effect, and the landscape starts changing a great deal.
I think that's absolutely right. I think we need to pretty quickly look at some retrofit to support the right behaviours, because whatever this new working world stabilises into, it will be different to the working world of 4 months ago. I think the pendulum will probably swing back about halfway, so that's going to be different. But I suspect the next virus that hits us won't be biological; it'll be digital, and that, for me, is the kind of systemic threat to the global economy. And that's what I want to, ensure that businesses like ours and all of ours are as protected and as aware. And ordinarily, if we've done the 5-year leap in 5 months, or whatever the quantum is, we'd have had 5 years to catch up and get used to it. So I think now that retrofit and catch up to get the next digital virus and head that off is important.
Yeah, and we've seen it propagate, large viruses propagate throughout the world. Like I think WannaCry was one of them. I'm going back a ways, but basically, it hit, at least from what I remember, it hit in Asia first, and then just as people came online, it just went global. And so, because I was in New York at the time, realizing that London was, our London offices were breached, and it was heading our way, kind of. But so we've had, unfortunately, practice doing that. But to your point, I think this time it's going to catch us all unawares. We just have to make sure that we're all in a position where we can react quickly enough to be able to address it. So, but I have another question that came out for the panelists, which is, how do you see the use of digital technology in commercial operations in a day-to-day B2B selling, as in remotely. I'll let you guys think about that for a second, and I can start talking about it, and feel free to jump in. But basically, so to me, B2B selling, more so than a lot of things. I mean, I'm not talking about the industries that require physical presence, like hospitality and etc. But B2B selling is part of the trust, the product. It requires more physical interaction, or it used to. I'm not sure whether that's still true in the past. That is certainly evolving, but buying new equipment, new vendor offerings, other than security, I think requires more of a physical interaction than we're seeing right now. Any thoughts?
So if it's a digital product, it's not so challenging, but yeah, it's a more like Simon, I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on this one based on your business model.
It's going to be an interesting one for sure. I don't know if we've fully got our head around it. It's a very good question, a very hard question. You can see the audio participants here. Yeah, when we're looking at selling, when we're looking at developing things that aren't necessarily digital in their presence, so large capital infrastructure projects, for example, anything we're doing within the built environment space, that's always done in a B2B selling context, isn't it really? The consumers aren't involved in that at all. Technology, for us, we've seen it quite interesting because in the face of it, where we are with a lot of the projects, it's all about engaging and continuing where they were in their process, be it in the design or the build or the operation state, and using technology to enhance that. What we've not yet seen happen, and this is, I guess, interesting to see what the other panelists think as well, of any new projects that will start to come about, particularly as the government do lots of various projects as economic stimulus activities, what that will look like and how they will be fundamentally changed through technology. Are we just going to see it's going to be as is, just with a bit of augmentation, or is the whole delivery going to be done in a fundamentally different way? So I think the landscape is definitely going to change 100%. I'm not really sure how that will play out. I don't think yet, based on where we are. I think that'll be very hard for us to predict because of drivers the clients will have, or really the appetite from all parties involved. But it's going to be an interesting one for sure, I'd say.
Simon, do you think in your world, and there's sort of a couple of you that are in that space on the team here, do you think that that interaction has historically been because the experience of building a big infrastructure asset has required the ability to walk across a building site, or touch something, or understand something that's been, or go and visit something that's historically been done to see how that can be evolved for the next project? Does that get solved by use of technology? Could you do some kind of virtual or reality, augmented reality type experience to bring everyone on that journey in a more real sort of inclusive way?
I definitely would agree on that. But yes, I think a lot of the activities that would have required a lot of bodies on site, we can very much see reducing. And your example there of, let's say, reality capture or visualization technologies is quite apt, because we're seeing this on a number of projects now for us, where we would have mobilized teams from the UK, let's say, to somewhere in the world to conduct a physical inspection of some capacity, to do a set task, take part in a material sample range survey. Bridge bearings are being purchased. You've got to go kick the tires and see what it looks like. And the current climate has meant that all that has to be switched to some type of virtual remote activity instead. So if we can make better use of on-site operatives who are already there to conduct tasks that aren't necessarily highly specialist, or a way of using that technology to mean that when you have specialist skills required, you don't have to send huge teams. It can be much reduced teams, and then let's say experts can be centralized in one office and disseminate it, as we've seen with the medical profession wanting to have a couple of expert doctors in pockets around the world, and then surgery all done remotely. Ultimately, if that was possible with latency, of course, and that's much more of a critical part there than it would be in infrastructure construction. But I feel that's the way we're going to have to go, and we're starting to see that in what we're doing. And I guess in Nathan's perspective in Costain and the actual contractor side of it, it must be a similar world as well.
It is. I mean, fewer humans on a construction and assembly site is normally a good thing because it's safer. But now with the proximity situations taken into account as well, that's definitely accelerated off-site assembly and more modular construction, which can be done by bots and then brought onto the site and assembled quicker using sort of more simple to assemble on site, and the complexity is elsewhere in a controlled environment. But I think I was just going to say that I think, and it's not my sector at all, but online retail would prove over the past 4 months that these are perfect trading conditions. So I think we need to look kind of multi-sector, and I wonder what all sectors can learn from the advanced logistics and online retail growth that has been forced upon us. But they're certainly the beneficiaries of these new trading conditions. So I don't know what the answer is for infrastructure like myself, but it would be interesting to try and understand what that version of the new economic relationship between consumers and providers looks like.
I think in a way, from what I can tell, it becomes more about meritocracy than anything else. It becomes about the quality of the product, regardless of what the product is, rather than, for example, from a B2B perspective, if you take the physical human interaction out of it, rather than the personality or personal characteristics of the person selling it to you. And I think that applies across the board also to remote hiring, for example. It becomes and given the fact that we can actually pull from a larger resource pool that's outside of metros, it becomes more of a truer meritocracy, because you're selling your talents, your product, rather than your personality and your ability to do the job. That applies also to the retail world. Those retailers that are thriving are the ones that are selling better products, possibly a better customer experience, not necessarily the fact that it's some slick salesperson. And I don't mean to take, this is not negative. I admire slick salespeople because they meet their quotas, but it's not based on the strength of the product itself. And I think that what we're seeing of what COVID has forced us to do is actually evaluate things digitally on the strength of the products themselves, certainly if they're new products, rather than take the personality of the person trying to sell it to us out of the equation, which could be a good thing. It's certainly a new thing at the moment, but I would argue, if it's done correctly, it does become more of a true meritocracy across the board for a number of sectors, a number of interactions. But yeah, it's still evolving.
If you go back to the cycle, if the psychology that I've been understanding recently is true, then if that trust piece comes over a period of time, and I'm sure if you're going to do a big infrastructure project, you wouldn't trust someone on the basis of 6 or 7 hours of conversations with them. I'm sure people materially longer than that. But how then do we? It goes back to Gavin's point around getting the best skills around the world, whatever the sector or industry is. But how do you then get your teams, your delivery teams, your tech teams, your sales teams to be able to exhibit trust over these sorts of platforms more quickly than they would ever have needed to in the past, when a nice dinner out or a few pints or something actually was quite often the way to open up those fluid conversations around someone's personal life, or just get to know someone so they therefore trust you. So those conversations you can't easily replicate here, but the model will change, and the skill set to use these platforms more effectively will change. And maybe one day we'll be, instead of sort of 2-dimensionally on a screen with 5 or 6 boxes, and we're also looking at each other, will be 3-dimensional or something more advanced. And then it will return to how we used to experience it a bit more.
That's where you get the virtual reality from. Everybody's on headsets now. That's the next progression,
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, we will be something along those lines. Like I enforced, and I do mean enforced because I had so much resistance from being on a virtual coffee morning every day, virtual coffee break, and we split all the teams out and basically rotate everybody in and out of different rooms. So you talk to everybody over the course of 3 or 4 weeks. You've spoken to everybody, and they all hated it to begin with. Like, well, not all, but a lot of them didn't want to do it. wrecking my day, don't need to do this. Within 3 weeks of it, they just all love it. And they all get to talk to people that they wouldn't even have talked to in the office. So anyway. And it's just, and because it's cameras, you're in somebody's house, because you can see every simple conversations, little things, but that's worked really, really well. And then we tried one of the absolute nasty, but that one worked. But it hit resistance to do it. You know, otherwise you're going to have that isolation that I think you spoke to earlier on. That it was the fear that people will just become disconnected. You know, they'll do the job, but they'll become disconnected from the rest of it, and that's the real risk of remote working and where we're going. We erode our cultures that we've spent a long time building and just be gone.
Well, yeah, I mean, the remote piece is just like, you know, when we're seeing people just get absorbed in their handheld devices, you know, just, and that's it. They'll you know, you used to see them, I should say. You know, you go to a restaurant, you see a family of four sitting around a table, no one's talking to each other, they're all on their devices. So we're doing the same kind of thing, you know, on a broader scale and scope. But if you guys, so I've been asked to start wrapping up, but I do have one question left, which is basically, we touched on it very briefly. It was about the outsourcing piece that Philip mentioned. The fact that a lot of vendors are passing on their, you know, their savings when they're taking advantage of a broader talent base, etc. So, and I've been asked this before. Are any of you planning, from a leadership perspective, planning on insourcing any more? I mean, what do you think the future of outsourcing looks like, or is it too soon?
I think, I mean, I'll sort of perhaps kick off. So at the point of COVID hitting, I had 700 people through partner and direct overseas, roughly. And in India, I think the government gave them 2 days notice. In the Philippines, they had less than 24 hours notice, materially less in one city. And those teams managed to operate. So the Philippines crew, they sort of slept in the office and nearby hotels. They were inside a cordon, they couldn't go anywhere. India, they all went home, took their laptops with them. That had never been historically allowed before. Totally secure from an IT perspective, but they weren't just policy said they weren't allowed to do that, but that changed in a heartbeat. So, and they all operated brilliantly. And the goodwill that came from being allowed, those people being allowed to work, you know, safely, without traveling, with their families, and all that brings, has gone a long, long way. And I'm checking in with my India teams, both from, you know, not just this role, but previous roles as well, to see how people are. And you know, obviously India is getting worse out there. But yeah, I think there's a huge amount of goodwill that goes with that when they can, culturally, that their family means a lot to them over in some parts of the world. So yeah, it didn't really have a material impact at all, as far as I can see.
Yeah, I think if we look at what's coming next year, historically we'd always have a blend of contract workforce, etc. And therefore, if we feel there's capex projects that we're having, it's a roll in, roll out, yeah, you do more of it. But I don't think it's definitely not going to make scope. All right, let's move everything over there now because we can. I don't think that makes sense. It doesn't really just going for the sake of cash. It's more than money.
Yeah.
Look, I completely agree. I think it's we're a UK based firm, but we need to look internationally for best practices. So it's probably now going to form a bigger part of our resource mix and our sourcing mix. So I could see, later this year and early next year, us having relationships with consultants or contractors or partners overseas, which we probably haven't done for a number of years, and also looking at a more flexible employee model as well, maybe around associates or secondments. So it's nudged us rather than catapulted us into a different working model, I think. And obviously not all of that will be in-house. We'll want to turn the taps on and off as required.
So certainly on a positive note, we're seeing the fact that COVID-19 has made us more global and more integrated. So, we're reacting as as a species. I told you I always bring it back to biology no matter what. So I'm sorry. What were you saying, Gavin?
No, you're right. I think it's the first time there's a common denominator across the planet that everybody can relate to, and it's COVID.
Absolutely. It's the first real driver for digital transformation we've seen, isn't it? People be waving their hands and saying Industry 4.0 for years, but this is the thing that actually made people go, I need to do something.
Now we just have to explain to our CEOs how we were able to accomplish this in 4 days when, when we were saying it would take 5 years to do it.
You just needed one cyber vulnerability to show how you managed to do it in 40 days, didn't you?
Yes, that's true. So I think that's it from a questions perspective, unless anyone wants to add anything. But if not, this has been a fascinating session. Thank you